West and East came together in Egypt when President Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill, on their way home from Yalta, met in new conferences. First to arrive is King Farouk, Egypt's 24-year-old ruler, welcomed aboard an American destroyer by Mr. Roosevelt and his daughter, Mrs. John Bertiga. The earlier talks were brief and carried through without ceremony in the Western manner. Next visitor to call on the President is the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, Lion of Judah and descendant of the Queen of Sheba. He has not forgotten his country's war with Mussolini and realizes the strength that lies in international unity. A series of independent conferences was also held by Mr. Churchill at the Auberge du Lac, 40 miles from Cairo. Here, the PM met Ibn Saud, King of Arabia, father of 60 sons, whose romantic rise to power has already passed into the rich legends of the desert. Behind him stands his famous dagger guard of Arabs who never leave his person. This is the first time Ibn Saud has left Arabia. The American destroyer which brought him to Cairo had a huge desert tent erected on its carpeted deck. This meeting, conforming to the ancient and unchanging precepts of Arab ritual, lasted several hours. Even leave-taking becomes a ceremonial. Meetings with King Farouk and members of his government completed the British round of conferences. Most important of these was held at the Egyptian Council of Ministers' offices in Cairo, attended by Mr. Eden, Lord Killearn, and Sir Alexander Cadogan. A few days after these pictures were taken, and immediately following his proclamation of Egypt's declaration of war against Germany, Ahmed Meher Pasha, wearing the fez, was murdered by an assassin. The only sad note in these magnificently hopeful meetings.
USS Quincy, the U.S. naval warship, would hardly constitute as a mechanism where moderated peace talks would be held. The largest ship usually attracts the most attention, but also had the limitations. And yet, the Quincy, which accompanied many of her sister ships across the Pacific at the tail end of World War II, was also a ship with remarkable accuracy for long-range assaults on combat enemy vessels. By 1945, the ship would now be used as a powerful tool, a vessel, if you will, to make itself accessible to some of the most powerful leaders on the face of the earth while conducting peace talks that would have beneficial outcomes that would affect the world over. On February 14, 1945, just 2 days removed from the Malta Conference, where U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and England's Prime Minister Winston Churchill to discuss the future of Europe, Churchill and Wilson had met with Saudi Arabia's King Abdulaziz ibn Abdul Rahman Al Saud while docked at the Great Bitter Lake along the Suez Canal, where just days prior, the president had met with the Egyptian leader, King Farouk. The ship was beside other war cruisers and destroyers, with an air cap overhead of fighter planes to show the well-natured leader, Ibn Saud, the might of the American military. It was a display, while also being a show of force, meant to put America on notice with the king. The discussion entailed the king's unwavering support for Jews into Palestine. Al Saud, when in return, he met the full support of the United States government and its full-time protection from its military, and with a permanent military base at Daham in Saudi Arabia. The price? The United States would be the sole primary recipient to the kingdom's unlimited supply of its oil reserves. The United States would become the primary importers and control the oil regulating market in the Middle East for decades to come. It was what the Pan-Arabs had feared, that the Gulf would end up modestly pricing itself out, while the West takes full advantage and also subvert Arab power. The conference ended with a handshake. The partnership would forever change the landscape of the Saudi kingdom and the United States in more ways than one. Meanwhile, the Muslim Brotherhood, a pan-Islamic organization in Egypt, tries to usurp the remaining British crown influence in the country after winning its independence in 1922. King Al Saud, however, wanted to placate the British, for they only ally they needed when the emboldened King Saud took over Najd and Riyadh from the Ottoman Empire. The Brotherhood, also known as the Ikhwan, were not looking for expansionism into Europa, however, but wanted the Islamic Caliphate to be representative government. The Saudis were not in conflict with the idea of an Islamic Caliphate, but it had to be through the Saudi kingdom. Roosevelt saw the massive upside of having the Saud family and their endless oil reserves at their disposal. The kingdom had to have another benefit at their disposal, and it began funneling tens of millions to American officials in 1947. The Israeli Zionist lobby, through their largest organization at the time, the Zionist Organization for American, were being financially and politically supported by members of America's powerful government. King Saud knew the upside to having the influence of the world's most powerful government at your side. Thus began funneling tens of millions more that started with officials in the judicial and legislative branches, to where Salah Merrill, the U.S. consul at Jerusalem, would remark in 1882, Palestine is not ready for the Jews, and the Jews are not ready for Palestine. To pour into this impoverished country tens of thousands of Jews would be an unspeakable calamity both for the country and for the Jews themselves. The quickest way to annihilate them would be to place them in Palestine with no restrictions or influence from any civilized government and allow them to govern themselves. They would very soon destroy each other. As America supported Zionism under President Wilson, William Hale, the State Department ambassador to the British Army, stated that by doing so, he remarked that a global Muslim backlash would soon follow. As World War II arrived on the global stage, the Arabs were sympathetic to the Nazi regime due to the Saudis being quite the open critic of knowing an Israeli state would be right in the middle of Arab lands. Most of the State Department were opposed to Zionism at this time. The U.S. oil industry would soon join the Arab lobby, headed by the Saudis. A split between the Saudis and Israeli special interest groups began, and King Saud spoke out against the Jews in the Palestine problem, to which President Wilson was quite understanding of, and sided with Ibn Saud on many issues, including this one. This was rather obvious, however, considering if Wilson was to side with the Israeli issue, they would prospectively lose the lucrative oil fields to Great Britain, to which the Saudis threatened to side with reluctantly if their demands were not met. King Ibn Saud was adamant about Jews having to live in Palestine, and he often became quite demanding about this, not being given the attention it deserved. Ibn Saud even remarked once to a state staffer that the Jews should be given to homes in Germany, since that is where the Holocaust took place, not in Palestine. By the time the U.S. elections ended in 1933, Wilson would end up being replaced by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not made aware of the Saudi-Israeli problem and promised Ibn Saud that no move would be made without confronting him first. However, Roosevelt supported an unrestricted immigration to Palestine and a future Jewish state. Secretary of State Edward Stenson Jr. warned Truman that likely pressure from Zionists in the United States would make trouble for the Saudi interest under Roosevelt. Truman became an advisor of sorts in American politics after his presidency and knew of the incoming problems Roosevelt would come under if he didn't satisfy both. In 1945, the United Nations was just ratified. In the same year, the Arab lobby became official. But it wasn't easy, since the Arab lobby happened to run into problems due to its inherent extremism. The United States knew of the rampant human rights abuses the Saudis posed, slavery, women not having many freedoms, beheadings, etc. Truman, however, believed that a viable Jewish state should be created to fulfill the promise of Lord Balfour. Truman would pen a letter to Ibn Saud on October 13, 1946, in which he stated, quote, I do not consider that my urging of the admittance of a considerable number of displaced Jews into Palestine or my statements with regarding to the solution to the problem of Palestine in any sense represent an action hostile to the Arab people, end quote. But Roosevelt would not allow the Arab-Israeli issue to get in the way of the enriched, untapped oil fields that the Saudi kingdom provided. And by 1947, U.S. companies were just finishing the construction of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which would carry Saudi oil to the Mediterranean for transshipment to Europe. Even with Ibn Saud's adamant position toward the partition of Palestine, the Saudis knew that by placating to the United States, they would have the world superpower at their disposal. As the Zionist-backed Stern and Irgun gangs began their own genocide, leaving many thousands of Palestinians displaced and heading off to Syria and Jordan, the Saudis, in turn, threatened to deny pipeline rights to American companies if the government didn't change its policies toward Israel. It was the first time the Saudis actually used their bargaining skills against the country it solely catered to for help and support. However, Ibn Saud would not be threatened the U.S. Saudi interest further, even with its adamant disapproval for an Israeli state. There was literally too much at stake for the Saudis, who didn't want to deal with the British, for they were the ones responsible for the partition of Palestine, or the Soviets, because communism would become the direct threat in the region. Ultimately, the sole primary reason for the Saudis dependent on the United States was basically to keep the Saudi royal family solvent and having their continued support by its military to safeguard the kingdom from its enemies. The Palestinians would ultimately not have the support of the Saudis in mind. Clark Gifford, in a memo to Truman, would write on March 3rd, 1948, "The fact of the matter is the Arab states must have oil royalties or they go broke." On May 14th, 1948, Israel would declare its independence. The response of the Arabs worldwide was highly critical. The Gulf Arabs were demurred, however, for they did not wish to lose the superpower of the United States. Instead, they spoke about the themes of the future. The United States knew this would upset many in the kingdom. Thus, they began noting the themes of the future regarding the Arab-Israeli problem. 1. Support for Israel weakened U.S. ties with the Arab world. 2. The Arab-Israeli conflict is the root of all problems. 3. U.S. pressure can change Israel policies, and each leverage should be used to fence Israel to capitulate to Arab demands. 4. The most important U.S. policy objective is to secure the supply of oil, and to do so, the Arabs must be placated. By 1950, Israel names Jerusalem as its capital. The United States, however, refuses to recognize the move and establishes its embassies instead in Tel Aviv. The United States pressures visiting countries not to commit to Jerusalem as well. Almost immediately, Israel begins to commit to certain advocates inside the U.S. government to counter the Arabs' influence. They solidly strung ties while forcing the Soviets to support socialist revolutionary regimes in Syria, Libya, Egypt, and Iraq. The Soviet secret war against the United States would be for regional predominance in the Middle East. With the threat of a Cold War, the Saudis took full advantage of the United States to forcibly support it or fear them being lost to the Soviets. By 1953, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower became the 34th president and immediately began taking office supporting Israeli state priorities. Eisenhower's Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, brother to Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, reinforced his views of Arabs in the State Department, which were quite favorable, causing a visible split within the White House. Eisenhower wanted to bolster conservative Arab regimes to prevent Soviet influence, and in order to do so, he needed to support the Israelis, for they would be the extension of the U.S. military. Arab socialism was becoming a direct threat to the influence of the United States, led by its Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, who saw fit to nationalize the oil away from the becoming regulated Western interests. The Soviets wanted to have an optimistic future with the Arabs, especially the Shia-led minority, not the Gulf Sunnis, who were considered too primitive. The United States had another problem, however: Saudi deference to waste spending and borrowing money from U.S. coppers and lobbyists. The kingdom, under Ibn Saud, wasted hundreds of millions, leading many in the kingdom to become too critical of its own government, especially its religious Salafi percentage. Eisenhower was not deterred by this fact and instead knew the importance of having the Saudis as a primary player against the Soviets, since the Saudis had the most important commodity the Soviets were ultimately after themselves. In 1957, Eisenhower provides a grant to help develop a Saudi Air Force base located in Darheim in the Eastern Province, and also promised to provide training to the Saudi Royal Guard to the cost of $50 million US. but even Saud was disposed by his deteriorating health due to heart disease and arthritis. He would father 45 sons, for which he tapped his most prized son, Faisal, to become future king. However, in 1953, Ibn Saud had passed away due to his ailing conditions, and Saudi bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, who was the prime minister of the Saudi kingdom, took the throne. King Saud wanted to change his father's mentality that the kingdom focused on its military and ignored internal problems. Saud's war was focused on poverty, ignorance, and disease, with the equitable application of the dictates of the holy Sharia laws to all without exemption, and the creation of a strong army. Saud also wanted to solidify relationships with other Arab countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Eisenhower invited King Saud to undertake an official visit to the United States in 1957, since he believed that King Saud played a crucial role in implementing his doctrine of deterring and fighting communism in the Middle East and the Islamic countries. He also discussed with the American president his dispute with Britain over the Al Baryami oasis and an oil zone between the frontiers of Saudi Arabia. With the country's increasing oil production, things started to change from within, but Faisal clashed often with Saud about the rightful heir successful to the throne. Faisal didn't forget about what his father had promised to him as a youth, and the ruling power of the kingdom, however, belonged to the ulema, the religious authority of the Wahhabi doctrine. Without this, Saud had no power to deter Faisal, and in March of 1964, Saud finally relented and named Faisal regent with full executive powers, effectively reducing himself to a figurehead. Eisenhower's presidency was led by a staunch support for Saudi Arabia in his later years, and he suddenly became the least vocal supporter of Israel in American history. This was led by the dullest influence of Arabs in the region, and how by supporting fully the Saudis, this would deter the Soviets from becoming a true superpower. Something Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA, warned the government about as the Arab socialist movement became a focal point and a direct threat to the West in the future. Eisenhower did not share Truman's position regarding support for Israel. John Dulles reinforced his views of the Arabs in the State Department, which saw the Israelis as also unfavorable for the time being due to the Soviet threat to the Middle East. The Soviets, in their conquest to beat the United States for regional dominance, tried to buy friends in the Arab world by supplying them with weapons, namely countries like Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. At the end of Eisenhower's administration, and with the start of the John F. Kennedy administration, the United States would not back a sale of arms to Israel, which was once on the table 6 months prior. This was due in part to the current line of thinking that by approving the sale of arms, it would also hurt Arab relations for the future. The Organization of the Petroleum Companies, OPEC, was created in 1960, located in Baghdad, Iraq. This was to help nationalize the oil from the West. In just a few short years, Aramco, Gulf, Mobil, SoCal, and Standard Oil would meet with State Department officials to voice concern about Nasser and the spread of communism in the Arab region. Nasser had declared that oil was a source of strength for Arab support against Western imperialism. As Kennedy took office in 1961, the United States tried to repair relations with Nasser's Egypt. The Saudis warned, however, that Egypt was a dangerous socialist regime and that by supporting them, they would be supporting the direct threat to the kingdom. Faisal had no hesitation to forward his concerns with the Kennedys against Nasser and the communists. And on November 3rd, 1962, the kingdom asked the United States to intervene militarily against Egypt. The war began with a coup d'etat carried out in 1962 by revolutionary Republicans led by the army under the command of Abdullah as-Salah, who dethroned the newly crowned Imam Muhammad al-Badr and declared Yemen a republic under his presidency. The Imam escaped to the Saudi Arabian border, where he rallied popular support from northern Shia tribes to retake power, escalating rapidly to a full-scale civil war, as Salah was supported by the Soviets and wished to take control of the Gulf. Operation Hard Surface began, and the United States Air Force, using the base they built in Tahrir, deterred the Egyptians from coming any further toward the Saudi kingdom. Kennedy was met with an untimely end on November 23rd, 1963, with his assassination by unknown gunmen in Dallas, Texas. With the Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson becoming the nation's 36th president, he reversed course regarding past presidents' position toward Israel. Johnson would become its primary focus. In just 2 months into his presidency, Johnson signs an executive order and sells weapons to Israel, and once again in 1965, and becomes Israel's main supplier for weapons. He also sends to the Saudis $500 million in arms and installed missile defense systems. Johnson saw the importance of continuing relations with the Arabs, especially the Saudis, as they were becoming a burgeoning influence in American politics, spending tens of millions on buying friends. The Arab communists, however, tried to force things their way, and on June 5, 1967, Egypt and Syria launched a preemptive strike against Israel, commonly known as the Six-Day War. It witnessed the quick defeat of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The defeat of the Arabs morally depleted them in return. This led to the quick denouncement of Arab-led nationalism once supported by Nasser. On January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon becomes the 37th president of the United States, and Nixon was much more experienced in regards to the geopolitical details involving American interests in the Middle East. Henry Kissinger becomes the United States Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and it was Kissinger who was shrewd and known for his slight acumen toward the Arab-Israeli position in which he used to his favor. With the death of Nasser in 1970, Anwar Sadat would become his successor and third president of Egypt. His presidency would turn the country around at a complete 180-degree angle, starting with improvising relations with not just the United States and Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates, but also with Israel. Sadat also wanted to repair the relations of the subjugated religious minority under Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis, however, were vying for more American influence in its political spectrum, knowing full well the Israelis were also trying to do the same, as they created the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in 1963. The bipartisan committee was slow to gain influence, however, and under King Faisal, the Saudis wanted more political backing to try and supplant the Israeli lobby in general. The Saudis had no domestic lobby to speak of, but by 1973, Faisal told U.S. oil company executives that Zionists and communists were on the verge of having American interests thrown out of the area. This was the first assertive toward charging U.S. policy in the reign of the Saudis. Oil executives from SoCal and Mobil then flew immediately to Washington, D.C., and met with lobbyists about U.S. policy change toward Israel, or else lose the Saudis altogether. Almost immediately, Mobil published a full-page ad in the New York Times about the U.S. stance in the Middle East peace. Mobil explained how the American way of living would depend on how the U.S. viewed their interests in the region, especially towards Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two largest oil exporters in the region. At about the same time, SoCal sends a letter of 200,000 letters of its employees and 262,000 letters of its shareholders, asking them to pressure Washington, D.C. to support the aspirations of the Arab people. The Saudi lobbyists were beginning to notice the value of their worth regarding American interests. Nixon valued the Saudis, but also knew he had a main ally with Israel. Both were trying to gain more influence in the U.S. government, while the lobbyists went to full-scale war for power in the White House. In the summer months of 1973, a group of 10 oil executives held a meeting with John J. McCloy, a renowned lobbyist himself. Under Secretary of State William Casey, who would later become director of the CIA, was also present. The main premise of the talk was the U.S. position in the Middle East, which was weakening. The fear of losing Saudi support to the Soviets was the real fear here, and the Saudis wanted to pressure the United States' position regarding the Israelis. And on October 6, 1973, Egypt, led by Sadat's wish to regain honor amongst the Arabs from their previous failure 10 years ago, along with Syria, had attacked Israel. 5 days later, King Faisal, who met with Sadat 1 month prior, and whom was told by Sadat that they would be attacking Israel for Faisal blessings, asked Nixon to stop supporting Israel. Nixon, however, sent a resupply of military weapons after being asked to help support them against their fight with the attacking Arab countries. On October 17, 1973, OPEC declared an oil embargo on the non-friendly states, which included the United States. Kissinger brokers a meeting with King Faisal and travels to Riyadh, the country's main capital and financial hub. Kissinger tells Faisal to lift the embargo. Faisal ignores the plea and tells Kissinger that Israel is supporting the communists' advance in the Middle East. Within the next few months, however, on March 18, 1974, the embargo is lifted. American sympathy for Israel after the war, however, grew. The Saudis, however, continued to waste spend, and Prince Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud, the U.S. Saudi ambassador, often remarked in an interview that as much as 50% of the $400 billion spent in 30 years of the nation's building was lost to corruption and mismanagement, leading many in the United States to witness the problem of the Saudi royal family, who had internal problems that would later become a problem for not just itself, but also for the United States. Adnan Khashoggi was the Saudi middleman in about 80% of the U.S. arms deals throughout the latter half of the 1970s and early 1980s. The United States, however, went through their own personal scandal, with Nixon becoming the first president to resign from office amidst the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford would become the first official without having been previously voted into either the presidential or vice presidential office by the Electoral College. And on August 1974, he was sworn in. Meanwhile, the Saudis continued to force the issue regarding their expanding political influence in the United States and abroad. The Saudi kingdom had warned other countries not to move their embassies to Jerusalem, just as the United States did 20 years prior. However, Canada announced it would move their embassy there, and almost immediately Saudi Arabia and Kuwait canceled more than $400 million in contracts with Canadian firms. The Canadian dollar sank in total value, and Canada postponed the move entirely. Ford's presidency concentrated on repairing relations with the Soviets. After visiting in Israel in 1975, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin remarked to Ford about the Israeli-Egyptian meeting, quote, "I wish to express my profound disappointment over Israel's attitude in the course of the negotiations. Failure of the negotiation will have a far-reaching impact on the region and on our relations. I have given instruction for a reassessment of United States policy in the region, including our relations with Israel, with the aim of ensuring that overall American interests are protected. You will be notified of our decision," end quote. For 6 months between March and September of 1975, the United States refused to conclude any new arms agreements with Israel. Rabin notes it was an innocent-sounding term that heralded one of the worst periods in American-Israeli relations. Ford's presidency was met with relative redundancy overall regarding the future of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And on January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter would be sworn in after a narrow defeat over Ford. Carter won the popular vote by 50 to 48 and received 297 electoral votes to Ford's 240. Carter, however, reneged on almost all of his campaign promises to Israel. In his reelection in 1980, Carter suffered this and saw the lowest Jewish turnout rates not seen since 1924. Saudi Arabia also witnessed a transfer of power. King Khalid had died on June 13, 1982, and Fahd bin Abdulaziz Al Saud became the kingdom's new leader. Fahd was viewed as the de facto prime minister during King Khalid's reign, in part due to the latter's ill health. Fahd had once led the Saudi delegation to the League of Arab States in 1959, signifying his increased prominence in the House of Saud and his being groomed for a more significant role. Even though Carter was a humanitarian, he fully supported Fahd in Saudi Arabia. Carter wanted to reverse the arms sale of Israel and stop using weapon transfers as a foreign policy instrument. He was also against the building of Israeli settler homes, which he saw as an obstacle for peace in the region. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, believed that it was important to solve the Palestinian problem to protect American interests in the Persian Gulf. And by 1977, Carter became the first president to declare open support for Palestine. Carter's next plan was to have Israel and Egypt come together to a peace agreement. The Saudis disapproved of the plan, however, and in return for their disapproval, Carter sold $1.5 billion worth of arms to the kingdom, the largest sale of U.S. military-grade weaponry to the Saudis ever. By 1980, the Saudis were now establishing a formidable lobby inside U.S. Congress. They believed the sole reason for this was the weakening of the Israeli lobby under Carter. After the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1979, the U.S. policy toward the Arab-Israeli peace shifted to regional security. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, and the Saudis witnessed an attempted coup of their own as Saudi militants led by Juhayman al-Otabi on October 20th, 1979, took over the Grand Mosque of Mecca. The kingdom under King Fahd wanted to change the strategy of having an Islamic ulema become the prominent governing body rather than the government led by the Sudari Seven, which are the seven lineage of Ibn Saud. In the course of all this, oil prices rose to approximately 60%, which dragged down the American economy. This would ultimately witness Carter lose the re-election. Just months prior to the re-election, however, Carter lobbied members of Congress to support Arab positions on arms sales and opposed recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In return for this show of loyalty, the Saudis donated tens of millions to the Carter Center, a non-governmental, not-for-profit organization founded in 1982, whose stated goal is to advance human rights and alleviate human suffering in more than 80 countries, with a large percentage of them in Arab nation states. King Fahd would later state in an interview that if Israel agreed to withdraw from the disputed territories, Saudi Arabia would be willing to bring other Arab states and the Palestinians to the table and negotiate peace. It was a clear tactic to win support for an arms deal that was being supported by Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States in 1981. 8 months later, the deal went through. And under the Reagan administration, Prince Bandar bin Sultan would become the 6th U.S. Saudi ambassador, but his tenureship would become a revitalization of U.S. Saudi foreign relations overall. The Soviets would witness defeat as the United States began covertly supplying Stinger missiles to the Afghan Mujahideen through the Gulf states, which turned the tide of the war. By 1984, Reagan had won re-election against Democratic nominee Walter Mondale. Just 2 months into his second administration, Reagan bypassed Congress to authorize the sale of 400 Stinger missiles to the Saudis. The kingdom noticed that their value during the Afghan-Soviet War and wanted to purchase a large amount. The continued effort of having the Israeli lobby at bay from American influence, Bandar bin Sultan started campaigning lobbyists to support Saudi infrastructure and oil at relatively low prices. It worked. And within the next 20 years, the Saudi lobby became a prominent fixture in American foreign policy, led by Prince Bandar, who would grow to have a close relationship not just with the Reagans or the Clintons, but with the Bush family in particular. Reagan's vice president was George H.W. Bush, a former CIA director and also former oil equipment salesman for Dresser Industries. Bin Sultan would have an even closer relationship under his son, George W. Bush, in 2001-2. The Saudi lobby would become a de facto political force ever since, leading many dissidents toward the corrupted waste-spending kingdom, whose puritanical ideology of Wahhabi Islam to spread to the poorest Arab nations to become outspoken advocates. However, the United States special interest groups in Washington, D.C. have a vested interest in regulating the oil market. Hundreds of millions, even billions are at stake, to which even the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, where evidence showed that certain prominent Saudis financed some of the terrorist operatives inside the United States, was covered up by the highest officials in the White House. To this day, the Saudis, along with the backing of the U.S. government, are interfering with 9/11 victims' families' investigations and civil suits that could very well illuminate the Saudi role in the attacks, which would promptly embarrass their U.S. protectors in return. However, the cover-up continues. Oil is definitely thicker than blood when it comes to protecting U.S. Saudi interests.
Let me just finish up with a few quick points. As I was saying, we're 20 years removed from 9/11, and there seems really no basis to claim that sources or methods would be endangered by revealing this information. And if there are, the government should at least make that point. So far, it has failed or refused to do so. It has refused to provide any explanation or justification. So I went to the floor of the United States Senate last week. I'm going to be there again this afternoon. I encourage my colleagues to join me in the weeks leading to 9/11. And I encourage the families to do what they are doing today, which is to raise this issue as vehemently and vociferously as they can to arouse the conscience of the American people, because the American people should be outraged that their government continues to conceal this evidence and information without any explanation or justification to them. This cause is bigger than these families, even though it is justice for them that is immediately at stake. The Saudi government ought to be held accountable in court and in the court of public opinion if it deserves it. And the credibility of the United States of America is on the line here, which is a powerful reason to make this information public. All too often, we sit through classified briefings, and I ask at the end of many of them, why the American people can't know what we've just heard. Documents are overclassified as it is in many areas, and in this area there is no justification for continued secrecy, at least so far as the government has explained.